Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Watercolor Hour. My name is Betty McDowell. I'm one of the librarians here at Pflugerville Public Library, and today I'm going to be walking you through painting a watercolor pumpkin. So you should have 5 shades of watercolor paint on one of these cards. Yours will look better because you haven't used it yet. You should have a scrap of watercolor paper for testing out your colors. You should have a copy of the finished painting, the pumpkin outline for tracing. This is the reference photo we're using, so you should have a copy of that. And you should also have a half sheet of watercolor paper, and you will have a round brush and a detail brush. So you are going to want to grab a pencil for tracing the outline, as well as some paper towels or a towel to wipe your brush on, a palette for mixing your paint, and a couple of cups of water. So we're going to use 2 cups of water today, one for rinsing and one for wetting the pumpkin, so that our pumpkin doesn't look muddy. We want to use clear water. Okay, so we're going to start by checking out our colors. So we have this warm yellow color, Indian yellow. We have permanent orange, and this one gets sort of separated, so you may have to mix it a little bit with your brush. We have permanent red deep, which is a really nice bright red. Ultramarine, which we're not going to use too much, just for shadows. And olive green, which will just be used on the stick. And all of these paints are tube paints by Van Gogh that I just drop onto these cards and wait till they dry. So the first thing you want to do to get started on your painting is to trace the pumpkin. So you can use a light box or do what I did, because I couldn't find the power cord to my light box, which is just tape it to the window and trace it that way. So this is going to be using a lot of wet on wet. So we'll be getting the pumpkin wet and then dropping paint in. So I'm going to start, because this is in sections, I'm going to start with a section, skip a section, work on the next one all the way around, so that I don't have to wait too long for it to dry. I can just keep moving. And then when those sections are dry, I can come back. So I'm going to grab clean water. And we're going to be using a mix of the yellow, orange, and red. So there's no exact mixer to this. I'm just using, going from light layers to dark layers. So, and I actually have progress photos here, and if you email me, I can send them to you. So this is what we're going to be doing first. We're going to be working on all of these sections. So I'm going to start with this one and just work my way around. And you can see, we're not going to cover the whole thing. So I'm grabbing my larger brush. And the reason I'm doing this is so that the color is a little more blended. It's not just a big block of orange. And also this way, I can drop different colors in. And since it's wet, they'll just kind of move around. Okay, so I'm going to use some of my permanent orange. Get my palette. I'll show you my cat palette because it's Halloween. And we're going to grab some of our orange. And I'm just going to run it along the edge here so you can see how it spreads out. And I do want it to be darker close to this curve, so I'm putting most of my paint along there. Because there are shadows in between all those curves, that's where we want our dark color. And so that this is not all the same color, I'm going to rinse off my brush and drop in some of the yellow. So it's not too different from the orange, but it's different enough that it'll give it a little bit more of a glow. And I'm drying off my brush, and I'm just gonna push this paint over here. Okay, so we've got one section done. I'm gonna rinse off my brush and start getting the middle section wet. This is gonna use a lot more water because it's a bigger space, so you may have to get your brush wet a few times. Okay, so this section will be similar, and the darker color is going to be along one side, so we're going to do it along here in the bottom. So we're not making this exactly like the reference photo, but if you look at it, you can see this is where the darker color is with the shadows. So I'm going to have darker paint here, and it's going to get lighter as it goes up towards this highlighted area. So I'm going to use my palette. And I'm going to mix some of the orange and just add a little bit of red. Just to make it a little bit darker. And if you mix extra, that's fine, because we're going to be using the same shade later on. Okay, I'm going to take this. Use that down in here. And I'm gonna get my brush wet, and then I'm just gonna use some of the orange and kind of fill in space. I don't want it to be too dark for this first layer, so now I've rinsed my brush off and I'm just kind of pushing the paint around. So this is where the highlight was up here in the reference photo, so I don't want to get too much paint up in this top corner, so I'm just using water. And I'm going to add some yellow down here. Again, just to make it look a little brighter in certain areas. We don't want it to all be the same shade. Okay, so what you don't want is hard lines. So if you end up getting an area where you can see a definite line, just take your brush, get it wet, and run it over the whole section. You can always come back and add more paint later if you end up taking some of the paint off with your water. So now I'm going to work on this section over here. And again, just water. And you can use some of this darker color that you mixed here in this section. And I'm going to add some yellow up here. So I got too much yellow, so I'm going to rinse my brush off and just use water to move this around. If you ever have too much paint, just get your brush wet, pull some of the paint up, and dry off your brush. And I'm going to use some of this, but watered down along this outer edge. So what we're doing is just making sure that we have some areas that are lighter and some are darker, some that are darker. And if it's too light, grab some more of this. If it's too light, that's not a big deal because you can always add more paint. If it's too dark, sometimes it can be a problem. This paper is pretty good about letting you wet the paper with your brush and kind of scrub some of the paint out. You just don't want to do that too much because you can end up with a hole in your paper. And there are also some colors that can stain the paper. This blue that we're going to use later is kind of hard to get out, so it's better to be too light in the beginning than to have your paint too dark. Okay, so we have our first 3 sections done. If it doesn't look exactly like this, that's totally fine. We're going to come back and add more paint later on. The important thing is that you do want each section to have different shades, so lighter orange, darker orange, and a little bit of yellow just to make it brighter. So I'm going to finish by doing this little section back here. And I'm just going to grab this paint that I mixed earlier, and I'm going to paint this whole thing. I'm not going to bother getting it wet because this is a darker section. And if you're wondering about this line here that we traced earlier, that is just going to be a little shadow that we paint later because there's a shadow coming off of this stem. So this area in between here will be darker. But for now, you can just paint the whole thing orange. Okay, so we're done with those sections. Now we're going to start painting these here. We just want to make sure that our paint is not too wet. So this is almost dry. This is a little bit wet. So I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes and then come back and do this. If you have a blow dryer at home, you can also use a low setting or the cool setting to dry this off to help speed things up. But I'm just going to wait a couple minutes and then come right back. Okay, so now we're going to be working on this next section. So same thing as before. This is pretty much the way we're going to do this. For each section, it's just going to be a matter of where the darker colors go and the lighter colors go. But the basic steps are the same. Get it wet and then drop some paint in. So for this one, we want our darker colors here. And again, that's just from looking at the reference photo. The dark colors are all along this section. So I'm going to mix some more of my red and orange. And run it along here. So I'm going to rinse my brush off because that's pretty dark and just start blending this out. So I want this section up here to stay paint free for now, or at least if there is paint there, it needs to be very light. I'm going to drop some of this in here. Whoops. Here, I just want this section to be a little bit darker. So one of the things we're going to be doing is dropping our paint in curves, because the pumpkin is curved. So on the final painting, you see all of these lines here with the shadows. So we're going to be trying to make it look not exactly like that, but we do want there to be some sections where there are these curved lines with paint. So I'm going to work on this section and just get it wet. And for this section, our dark paint is going to be along this side. So I'm just going to take it over here. And I need some more, so really quickly mix some over here. Now I'm going to rinse my brush off. I'm going to grab some of my yellow and just add it here. So if we're looking at a reference, this section is more of an orangey or a yellowy orange. So you don't have to fill the whole space in, but I'm rinsing off my brush now and just kind of blending it. Remember that the paint will dry lighter, so it looks a lot darker when it's wet. So if you're concerned if it's just a little bit darker than you think it should be, that's probably fine. I'm just taking my brush and blending this. And I'm going to rinse my brush off. So I've got mostly water on my brush. I'm going to grab a little bit of paint and we're going to work on this little section here. And I'm not going to get it wet first. I'm just going to fill it in with some light orange. And I'm going to grab orange a little bit, make it a little bit darker, and fill in this top section here. Alright, and rinse my brush off and grab. See, on my palette now I just have a mix of the darker orange and the yellow. So it's all blending together, it doesn't matter. I'm going to fill this section in here with some of the light mix of yellow and orange. And if you have trouble getting in the corners, you can always pick up your smaller brush and use that. And we've got one section left here. So I'm just going to grab some paint, make sure my paint or my brush isn't too wet, and fill this in with just a light layer of paint. Now this is still wet, so I do have to be careful that most of the water is out of my brush. I'm just going to be careful and try not to touch that other section. But if you're worried, just wait a little bit and you can come back to that later. And this is mostly dry. So I'm just going to put some light orange in here. And this is a small section, so this would be a good place to use your other brush. Okay, so now we've got a layer of paint on every section. And we're going to add a little bit of paint to the stem. So before we work on the stem, I just want to draw some stripes on it. So it kind of curves this way, so I'm just going to draw some lines. And they don't have to be perfect. There's no specific way to do them. I'm doing them in pencil. It doesn't matter if they're a little bit dark because they're going to get covered up by paint anyway. So now we're going to be using our olive green. And I'm going to make it a little bit darker with the ultramarine. Not enough water on my brush. So I've added some green. Now what I'm going to do is rinse my brush off and just fill in this space here with water. And I've got another section over here where I'll just do the same thing. And if you're more comfortable using the smaller brush for this, that may be better for you. And I'm just going to add some green paint over here. So I'm going to switch to my little brush. Got a space in here, so I'm just going to add some paint there and here. So you want to have green, but you want to have some white space in between. So now we're going to be going back to our pumpkin, and I'm going to start with this section and just work like we did earlier, jumping from section to section. So I'm going to get this whole area wet. And what I want to do is add really dark paint. So I'm looking at my progress photos. And so this section now is going to be pretty dark, and we're going to start adding in some of these lines that you see here, these curved lines with color. So instead of using my palette, I'm just going to get some paint directly from here so that it's not watered down. Make it pretty dark. Start adding it along this curve. And I'm going to rinse my brush off. And just make sure I have enough water out here. I'm going to grab some of the paint. And what I'm going to do is start making my stripes. So I'm just going to start at the bottom and take the paint and start making some lines like this. And if you feel like it's too difficult to do with this brush, you can use your smaller brush to do this. So we got that section done. We're going to do that over here as well. So just get it wet. And same thing, we want a really dark orange. So I'm using a mix of the red and orange. It's a little more red. And I'm just adding it on this side. And I want some of that down here as well. And now I'm going to start bringing it up this way. I'm going to rinse my brush off. I'm going to grab a mix of this color I have left in my palette so it's light and do the same. So it doesn't have to be exact. You can move the paint around as you need to. You can also take your smaller brush and use that. So for this area up here, I'm using my smaller brush. I'm just adding some more stripes. And now we're going to move on to the section over here. And I'm just going to get this wet. And because this is such a thin area, I am going to switch over to my smaller brush for the next part. And I'm going to use this dark mix here and just run it along this inside edge. So what we're doing is just making sure that these sections look curved. By making these areas darker and then having it fade out to a lighter shade. So while that's drying, I'm just going to start working on the stem. So maybe using the olive green. I'm going to use my small brush though. And I'm going to mix in a little of the blue. A little more blue than last time because I do want it to be darker. So I've got a really dark green. And I'm just going to follow these lines I made earlier. You may have to get a little more water on your brush as you go. And I'm just filling in some of these spaces with darker paint. So I'm just adding little stripes of this darker color. And there's no exact way to do this, just make sure that you leave space in between your lines. And I'm making this section darker just because on the reference photo it's darker over here. So now that the stem's done, this section should be dry enough to start working on. I'm just getting the whole thing wet. And as long as you didn't use too much water on your stem as you were painting, you shouldn't have trouble with it all bleeding together. And same as earlier, we're going to be using this mix of orange and red. And we want it to be pretty dark. And we're going to be adding it down in here. And along this curve. And I'm also going to rinse my brush off, and I'm going to add some yellow. I'm going to water it down a little bit. And blend it here into this darker shade. Rinsing off my brush and just moving everything around. Now I'm going to take my small brush. Actually, I'm going to keep using my big brush here. I'm going to grab some more of this dark shade here. And just make some curved lines. Just rinsing off my brush and blending these out. So this section, some of these lines are curved and some of them are a little more straight, so they're not all going in this direction. And you can just look at the reference photo and kind of see what the shadows look like. I'm going to drop some more yellow up here. Now I'm going to rinse my brush off. And I'm going to make a shadow color for this area here. So it's still wet. And what I'm going to do is use the ultramarine and the red to make a really deep purplish color. So we just want kind of an eggplant color. And I'm going to drop that into this section because these are the darkest areas on the pumpkin. So I'm going to use my small brush and just drop some of that purple in. So we just want that to be one of the darkest sections. Right. So next we're going to work on making this area darker. So getting it wet. And I'm just going to use some orange for this. With a little bit of red. It's not going to be super dark. And I'm just going to be making this whole section a little darker. Just dropping the paint in and sort of curved brush strokes. I'm going to use some of this shadow color that I made, the purple color, in here. This is another area where it's really dark. So this is mostly done. All we're going to work on is making some of the sections darker. So if you see a section that you think should be a little more of a deeper color, we're basically going to repeat the steps that we did earlier for each section. So this section is still really light. And get it wet. I'm going to use some of the deep orange. Just around here. I'm going to take my small brush because it's a small section. Just add some dark paint. I'm also going to use it to make some of these curves. And I'm going to add some of this shadowy color down in here. Okay, now I'm just going to look around and see which sections could be darker. This section here still looks light to me, so I know I just painted it. It's not quite dry yet, but I can go back over it for water and darken it. And I want some of the orange and red here. I'm going to take some of my yellow and orange mix and drop it here. Take some of my darker color and add it up here in this corner. So depending on what your pumpkin looks like, you may need certain areas to be darker, so just look at the reference and see where the shadows are. This section of the pumpkin in the reference is pretty light, so I'm leaving it that way. But I am adding some of these lines in with the dark paint, just to help it look like it's curved. And I'm doing downward strokes here because when you're painting, sometimes when you lift your brush off, it'll kind of throw the paint in a little, almost looks like a splatter. But if I do it going this way, the paint is just going to end up in this darker section, so it doesn't really matter if that happens. This section could definitely be darker. Now this is still kind of wet, so I do have to be careful. So I'm going to be concentrating on putting my paint here and trying not to let it run over to that side. So I didn't get the whole section wet just to avoid having everything kind of blurred. But I'm just going to add some more of the dark paint down in this corner. And just very carefully add different yellow and orange shades. So I've got kind of a light orange. I'm going to grab some of my yellow, drop it here. I'm just trying to make it look a little more interesting. And now I'm rinsing off my brush and just kind of blending it. Take a small brush and grab some red and orange mix here and just drag it. Okay, this section here I want to work on. And again, this is still a little bit wet, so I'm mostly focusing on this side. And I want kind of a golden orange. I'm just gonna add that here. Grab my small brush and just get some orange, whatever's left here in my palette, and add it in. Not going to make it too dark. This area could be darker. So I'm going to use my small brush and just grab some of this purple. And drop it in here. This is still a little bit wet, so I am just trying to be careful. But you may want to wait for it to dry before you do this. I'm just going to grab some orange. Some of the orange and red mix and make this darker. Rinse off my brush and just try to blend it. Now I've got these little sections up here that I do want to make darker. And because they're close together, it's going to be a little bit difficult to get them painted where they're not blending and all looking the same. So I'm going to use my small brush. I'm going to start with this one and just add some dark paint along the top. This is a mix of red and orange. And then I'm going to rinse my brush off and just add some water to fill in the rest of it. So when you do that, the top will be darker. This base, I'm just going to use some of the orange. Make that just a little bit darker. I'm going to take my orange and red mix and in here, add some dark paint to the top, rinse off my brush, and again be careful because this is wet down here. Just blend it. I want this a bit darker here. So I've just got some watery orange. And I'm going to work on this one. So same as I did before, get a mix of orangey, red, and make this a little bit more yellow so it looks different from the section next to it. Rinse off your brush. Okay, so we've got most of the pumpkin filled in. We need this little shadow, and this still looks a little light to me in comparison to everything else. So I'm going to add more paint and then we should be about done. So I'm not going to get it wet because these two sections are a little wet, so it's up to you. You can wait till it dries off or just keep going. I'm just going to keep going. But I'm not going to get the section wet because the water will spill over into these other areas. So I'm just adding some orange along here. Grab some a mix of yellow and orange. Put it on my brush. Here. Now I'm rinsing off my brush and I'm just going to add water in the middle. Again, if you see a section that's wet, just avoid it. Or wait till it dries, but I'm just being impatient. Okay. So, I'm out of orange. All right, so I'm just gonna do some more of this. All right, and I'm pretty okay with how this looks. Now I'm just going to take some of this and have enough left. Mix of red and blue. And fill this space in here. And this is just the shadow from the stem. So there is your pumpkin. I hope you enjoyed it. If you painted along, I would love to see it. You can either email me or leave it as a comment on our Facebook page. So next month we will be working on making some watercolor pine cones, so I hope you join me for that. Check the schedule for the registration dates, and I'll see you next time.